Saturday, 4th May, 2024. It was just after 7 a.m. in the quiet village of Lely. A grey van sat parked outside the Stag's head inn. Inside, there was no movement, only the quiet presence of a surveillance team steadily drawing closer. What followed wasn't chaos. It was calm, precise, and controlled. What they found inside would send shockwaves through the National Crime Agency. This wasn't a backstreet deal gone wrong. This was something else entirely. A shipment that shouldn't have made it this far. This is the story of two young men from Argyll and a Colombian smuggler came dangerously close to landing £42 million worth of cocaine, and how their plan unraveled just miles from the coastline. They weren't cartel enforcers, no aliases and no records. Just first names, small towns, and fishing routes. Mark Moran was 23, from Ardrishaig, a village tucked between the loch and the hills in Argyll and Bute. Daniel Livingstone, 25, came from Campbelltown, a place better known for whiskey than organised crime. They weren't living lavishly. There were no watches or cash stacks on show, but someone had approached them, someone with contacts far beyond Argyll. They weren't alone. Alongside them was Didier Tordesillas Reyes, a Colombian national aged 40 with no fixed UK address. The National Crime Agency would later describe him as the link, the contact point between the South American source and the UK shoreline. And then there was Anthony McAllister, 33, from Tynuilt, a lifelong seafarer who had, at some point, agreed to skipper a boat. He would later claim he thought the cargo was tobacco, and there is something special about him that we will discuss in the later part of this video. Livingstone was in debt. The offer was simple: a short job, big money, and no guns. Moran's role was bigger. The court heard he was the group's UK anchor, responsible for logistics and communications. Reyes had flown in for one reason alone: to bring the cocaine ashore. None of them had been on police radar before. They weren't known dealers and they had no history of major offences. But in the spring of 2024, they'd stepped into a smuggling network tied to Colombian supply chains and European distribution routes. In short, the NCA wasn't after street dealers. It was tracking something bigger, and it had eyes on the group long before the van doors were ever opened. The plan had started months earlier on the southern edge of the country. On 29th March 2023, Mark Moran and Didier Reyes arrived at Padstow Harbour in Cornwall. They used false names and paid £40,000 in cash for a second-hand fishing vessel. No paperwork delays or questions asked, just two men quietly buying a boat. From there, the vessel was moved along the coast to Southwold Harbour in Suffolk. It was moored there under the assumption that it would blend in among the other small fishing crafts lining the dock. At face value, it looked like a typical purchase. But the National Crime Agency was already watching. The surveillance had begun earlier that spring, part of a wider operation linked to suspected maritime trafficking along the eastern coast of England. In the early hours of March 30th, the crew made their move. On board were Moran, Reyes, and Anthony McAllister, the man allegedly hired to skipper the vessel. Their destination lay somewhere off the Suffolk coast in international waters. The mission was simple: collect the cargo and return unseen. But the journey was short-lived. Border Force officers intercepted them before any drugs had changed hands. The vessel was boarded and searched off the coast of Lowestoft. Officers found no contraband, not because the boat was clean, but because they'd arrived too soon. The cocaine hadn't yet been transferred. The men were allowed to go, but the interception changed everything. The vessel, already showing signs of wear, was no longer viable. McAllister had already voiced doubts about its seaworthiness. The group abandoned it soon after, leaving behind a boat worth £40,000 and months of planning. If they were going to try again, they'd need a new vessel, a new launch point, and a better route. The surveillance didn't stop. The NCA kept watching, waiting to see if the group would retreat or double down. The first try had quietly failed. No arrests or headlines have been made, just a boat intercepted too soon and a crew let go without charge. But they didn't walk away. By late April, they were regrouping. This time, the preparations were more careful and more desperate. Between 25th and 27th April, 3 members of the crew, Moran, Reyes and Livingstone, checked into the Holiday Inn in Hull. False names were used again. But this time, the surveillance teams monitored their movements in silence. They were watched as they travelled to Dewsbury, West Yorkshire, where they bought a 4x4 vehicle fitted with a tow bar, the type needed to launch a boat. Then came another boat. Not a fishing vessel this time, but something smaller, faster and easier to ditch. A rigid-hulled inflatable boat, the kind used for fast coastal travel, often by rescue teams or smugglers. They paid £6,000 again in cash for it in Wells, Somerset. It came with basic gear, oars, containers and ropes. Alongside it, they acquired a Volvo from Bristol, one more vehicle to cover tracks or haul cargo. Everything was documented in silence. No intercepted calls, no shouting across rooms, just text messages and movements caught on camera. What the crew did not expect was that the NCA watched it unfold in real time. On 28th April, the group took the newly purchased rib and moved it across the country. First to Grimsby, then on to Hull. They were scouting access points now, looking for launch spots that wouldn't draw attention. They settled on the Humber estuary, remote, tidal and near empty after dark. At Stone Creek, they carried the inflatable down to the waterline. It was remote enough to go unnoticed, but the tide wasn't in their favour. At 9:50 p.m, under pitch darkness, they tried to get the inflatable into the water. But lower than expected levels made it impossible. With no time to waste, they hauled it back onto land and abandoned it in a nearby car park, hoping no one would notice. They waited, just a few more days. The second launch, and the real pickup, would happen soon. And this time, they were betting it would work. By now, they had everything in place: the rib, the vehicles, the fuel, the team. After the first unsuccessful attempt, they didn't give up. On the 3rd of May 2024, the team made their next move. The rib was transported again, this time to the Humber Rescue Slipway at Hessel, beneath the shadow of the Humber Bridge. It was a public access slip, often used by leisure craft, just another boat being launched. That morning, Moran, Reyes and Livingstone arrived in convoy. Livingstone stopped to fill 2 large jerry cans with fuel, a red diesel, standard for marine use, ensuring the rib had enough range for the journey into open water and back. No sign of nerves or last-minute changes. The slipway was clear. The rib was lowered in. On board were Moran and Reyes. Livingstone stayed on land. He would act as their link, monitoring the shoreline, keeping watch, and preparing the van for the return. The NCA surveillance team observed every step. Still, they held back. Let it run. At sea, Moran and Reyes were headed toward a suspected rendezvous point in the North Sea. The working theory, a larger vessel, possibly a mothership, had already travelled from South America and was waiting offshore. This was the final leg, a handoff. Back on land, Livingstone was seen pacing the edge of the beach near Easington Caravan Park. He used a torch, not randomly, but in a pattern, deliberately pointed out to sea. He spoke on a mobile phone. The light flickered again and again. Hours passed. Then, just after midnight, the rib returned. It landed just below the caravan park, 18 miles from the launch point at Hessel. It was late, the beach was dark, and the timing had been calculated to avoid tidal interference. Surveillance teams watched as Moran and Reyes offloaded multiple black holdalls from the boat and into the rear of a grey Vauxhall Vivaro hire van. Once the bags were loaded, the boat was left on the beach, partially buried in the shingle. Life jackets and wet clothing were discarded beside it. They weren't trying to hide it, as it had served its purpose. The van was now full, and inside those holdalls, 524 kilograms of cocaine with a purity between 86 and 89%. Compressed into blocks, vacuum sealed and wrapped in black plastic. By the time they left the shoreline, it was 12:15 a.m. They didn't head for a warehouse or an industrial unit. Instead, they parked the van outside a quiet country pub, the Stag's Head Inn in Lely, and checked in for the night. They thought the hardest part was over, but the NCA was waiting for morning. By dawn, they thought they were clear. The van sat silent, but it wasn't alone. The National Crime Agency had waited through the night. They tracked the whole operation, and now they were waiting for the right moment to close in. That moment came at 7:53 a.m. on the 4th of May. Officers moved in quickly, armed but discreet, backed by Humberside Police, Border Force, and the Yorkshire and Humber Regional Organised Crime Unit. The van was surrounded, doors opened, the suspects were detained. Inside the vehicle, officers found what they were looking for, and more. A total of 524 kilograms of high-purity cocaine. Some packages were still wet from the crossing. The rib was later recovered from the beach at Easington, abandoned near the tide line. Alongside it, officers found fuel containers, clothing, life jackets, and what they left in a hurry, as we discussed earlier. This wasn't a last-minute job. It was organised, funded, and executed with precision until the final morning. By 9 a.m., the three men at the pub were in custody. McAllister was not present at the pub during the time of the takedown. However, he was arrested separately on the same morning as part of the coordinated NCA operation. They didn't resist, they didn't run, but the job they'd taken on was far bigger than they ever admitted to, and the full weight of that would land on them in court. The arrests made headlines, but the real story didn't end in that pub car park. To understand the scale of what they were part of, we need to look at where they came from, and who else was watching. This wasn't the first time men from Scotland's coastal towns had found themselves at the edge of an international trafficking operation, and it won't be the last. Because in the shadows of Argyll, Campbelltown and Tainwilt, places built on fishing, ferry runs and ferrying whiskey barrels across sea locks, a quieter shift has been underway. Criminal networks are watching these villages not for what they lack, but for what they offer: seafaring knowledge, weather resilience, and silence. In the last 5 years, law enforcement across the UK and Europe has been seeing the same pattern. Men with no serious records, from communities with tight shorelines and looser border checks, recruited not for what they've done, but for what they know, and for how unseen they can remain. Mark Moran and Daniel Livingstone weren't anomalies. They were part of a larger unfolding picture. In late 2022, the French Navy intercepted a yacht sailing from South America into European waters. On board, 40 bales of cocaine. Street value, £140 million. The skipper wasn't from Marseille or Madrid. He was from the Isle of Lewis, a Scotsman with maritime skills paid to transport cargo he'd claimed not to understand. His arrest was part of Operation Mentor, a pan-European crackdown on cartels using legitimate sailing vessels as drug ferries. Spain, Norway, and Scotland all featured heavily. The National Crime Agency didn't name every operation publicly, but internal court statements confirmed the growing focus on Scotland's west coast. Surveillance has expanded across port towns in Argyll and Bute, with flagged interest in small harbours at Ullapool, Oban, and even Barra. Not because they're dangerous, but because they're trusted and familiar places where a single boat can dock unnoticed if the weather's bad and the paperwork looks routine. Moran and Livingstone were raised around boats. That wasn't incidental, it was strategic. The vessel used in the first attempt had been bought legally. Cash, yes, but not suspicious in itself. No weapons, no threats. Just 3 men. What made it different was who they were tied to. Because once the NCA tracked messages back to their origin, they found encrypted threads stretching to Mexico, not just Colombia. Names and contact numbers that had appeared before, linked to other failed maritime runs in the Bay of Biscay. And that's the other part. The cocaine seized in Lely wasn't just high purity, it was branded, wrapped in plastic with distinctive markings used by South American producers to trace shipments through distribution tiers. It's a system the NCA and Europol have long confirmed, a kind of narcotic barcode. The packages in the Vivaro van bore identifiers linked to previous seizures in Antwerp and Bilbao. So when Reyes arrived from Colombia, it wasn't a gamble, it was an extension. As we discussed earlier, the National Crime Agency had described him as the link, the one who made sure the boat reached the right ship offshore, the one who could confirm the purity or reject the cargo outright if it didn't meet cartel expectations. That kind of trust doesn't happen by accident. It means this wasn't his first crossing. By the time Reyes was arrested, he was using a UK-registered phone. But the NCA believes his UK entry had been facilitated, either through forged documentation or legitimate tourist channels. They're still investigating how long he had been in country before May. His name doesn't appear on other active warrants, but his digital footprint matched partial traces from previous maritime smuggling cases. This was a cell, a low-level but crucial delivery point inside a larger chain. And Scotland, with its quiet harbours, untapped crews and under-policed waters, had become a valuable weak spot in Europe's Class A drug defences. And while this crew was taken down before delivery, the network that recruited them didn't vanish, because somewhere, just off the coast, another small boat is being fueled, and another van is waiting to be filled. In October 2024, inside Hull Crown Court, the conspiracy that began in silence, with boats, fuel cans and false names, was finally laid bare under the weight of courtroom evidence. The prosecution opened with the structure of the operation. What we've already discussed was now positioned as part of a wider cartel-led conspiracy. Prosecutors told the court this was not just a UK plan, but a South American-led shipment, orchestrated by organised criminal networks using UK nationals as intermediaries. Text messages recovered from mobile devices revealed detailed planning of routes, timings and coded exchanges. The group's movements from Somerset to Humberside matched the logistical instructions stored on their phones. Within those conversations, the Crown said, was clear evidence of financial motivation. Each man had allegedly been promised up to £13,000 for their role. Not a fortune, but enough to take the risk. The court heard the roles of each suspect that we have already discussed in the details at the very start of the video. Daniel Livingstone admitted his involvement early and pleaded guilty before trial on the 5th of June 2024. Moran, however, went to trial, maintaining he was unaware that the bags contained cocaine. But this decision to contest the charge was dismissed by the jury after an 8-day trial in October 2024. Reyes, for his part, made no significant defense, having pleaded guilty at an earlier stage on 22nd July 2024. Then came Anthony McAllister, the boat skipper from Tainewilt. His defense claimed he had no knowledge the cargo was cocaine and that he had been told it was tobacco smuggling. The jury believed him, and he was the only person acquitted on all counts. In sentencing, the judge made clear that this was a well-resourced and well-organised smuggling attempt. He rejected the idea that the defendants had been misled or unaware. The volume of cocaine, over half a ton, with a purity level exceeding 86%, left no room for naivety. Every man who took part knew this wasn't a small job. Mark Moran, 23, from Ardrishaig, was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment for conspiracy to import Class A drugs. The court viewed him as the primary UK coordinator. Daniel Livingstone, 25, from Campbelltown, received 7 years and 9 months after an early guilty plea. Didier Tordesillas Reyes, 40, a Colombian national, had pleaded guilty, but as of the most recent reporting in late December 2024, his sentencing had not yet taken place and was still due to be scheduled. After thorough research, we couldn't confirm whether that sentencing has since occurred. If anyone watching has seen a formal update, feel free to drop it in the comments below. What do you make of this case and sentencing? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more true UK crime stories like this one, subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with us. There's always another case to uncover.